If you're okay with, losing 1 to 2 kilograms, then exercise will be enough. That's usually not the weight goal that people come to us with. They want to lose more weight, and so that's really where you do have to diet. And I think that's one of the tricks why exercise actually, I include that often in my talks. It's also really helpful to prevent not only the weight regain, but also really helpful in preventing the weight gain in the first place. People who are more active tend to gain less weight than people who are sedentary.
Now talk. Say something about football.
What do you want me to say? Is it better?
Say England are really good at football.
I can't say that.
Over time, most people's weights are fairly stable, but we inevitably lose weight when we have an energy deficit. That is when we are ingesting less energy as food and drink than our bodies are using. So in principle, at least, we can get into an energy deficit either by using more energy, perhaps by exercising, or by eating less food, or both. But when we exercise, we tend to get hungry. So don't we eat more afterwards as a result? And what happens if we're dieting so that we're hungry while we exercise? Does that affect maybe our exercise intensity, for example? And when all's said and done, how important is exercise for weight loss compared to dieting for weight loss? I'm going to put these and other questions to the venerable Professor Karsten Koehler, who is an expert. He's an expert as one can get, in fact, in issues exercise, eating, and weight change. So, lucky me. Karsten, thanks so much for taking the time out to chat to me today.
Thank you for the very kind invitation. Happy to be here.
So, Gus, I wanted to start off now. I dug through your papers. I mean, we know each other anyway, and I have looked through some of them before, but I had an extra good dig through recently. One entitled, intriguingly, Why Exercise by Itself is Often Ineffective for Weight Loss, but Crucial for Weight Management. What's going on there, Karsten?
Well, I mean, it's of course a controversial, intentionally controversial title, but the idea is if we look at kind of all the evidence that we have, as you stated earlier in your opening statement, theoretically we have these two options. We can expend more calories, and that's something we primarily do through exercise. Of course, physical activity also plays a role, and I think we can dive in a little bit if you want to into some of the differences there. Or we can eat less, and then this is from a, let's say, thermodynamic standpoint, it shouldn't really matter whether we expend more or less, because as you said, we would both achieve an energy deficit, and that's really what drives changes in body weight, in this case weight loss. However, there is, as you already said, there are inherent differences in how we achieve that energy deficit. So just as a simple exercise of thought, we control 100% of the calories that we ingest. Every single calorie is a somewhat cognitive decision by ourselves that we put food in our mouth, or the other way around. We also, we can try. Some people may say they fail, but it's under our control how many calories we ingest. In the expenditure side, so everything that our body expends, it's a little bit more complicated because the piece that we expend in terms of exercise or physical activity is only a small portion of how much energy we expend in total. So let's say if I expend 2,500 calories a day, maybe 500 of these are decided by my physical activity and exercise, but the majority is actually driven by metabolic factors that I don't have actual control over. So how much my body expends just for basic processes, etc. So even that alone, gives you already a kind of perspective of how much you can actually, of a deficit you can achieve through dieting. Theoretically, you can achieve a 100% deficit through dieting. If you really, really ramped up your exercise, then maybe you can achieve a deficit of maybe 20 or 30%. But that's really for most individuals, mere mortals at least, that's really the maximum that we can achieve. And that's something we consider quite a high level of physical activity or exercise. So that's even just from that perspective. Then we add on top, of course, as you said, well, if we exercise, then usually what we do is, and we can see that in many studies, is that people start to eat more because our body doesn't necessarily want to lose weight. There's many signals our body sends to increase, at least over the long term, to increase food intake. So we're not losing any weight. So if I'm on a diet and I decide to eat less, usually I actively ignore these signals. I undereat on purpose, at least during the dieting phase. What happens afterwards is slightly different. But if I exercise and I don't pay attention to what I eat, we're usually, most of us are prone to eat to at least account partially for the calories that we've expended. So the kind of the initial deficit or the putative energy deficit that I've created through exercise actually becomes smaller and smaller. There is some individual variability. There are some people who actually will eat even less when they're exercising, so they will actually lose even more. There's a few people who actually eat more than they've expended, so they overcompensate. But the majority is somewhere in the middle, where they partially compensate the energy that they've expended as part of their increase in physical activity and exercise. So it's really kind of these things that's first of all how the energy deficit that really arrives in terms of the kind of in terms of the energy balance equation is we think it's the same, but there are of course these factors that contribute. And you may say, well, if I diet, actually people may start losing less. But again, this is kind of the same conundrum here. If I diet and maybe restrict my food intake by 50%, then I might reduce my activity by maybe 10 or 15% or so. That again, creates a much it's lopsided on the dieting side. So that's why if we look at studies that really compare exercise interventions versus diet interventions, we see that people who diet, as if it's well controlled, as long as they maintain the caloric deficit, they lose weight. At some point, they will start to reach a new weight plateau. That's what we all know, but that's actually similar with pretty much anything, whether that's bariatric surgery, whether that's Ozempic, or you name it. At some point, we'll start to reach a new plateau, unless we increase then drug dose, whatever you call. If you look at then compared to diet to exercising, we see again on average very marginal changes in weight, maybe 1 or 2%, but not the 5 to 10% that we usually achieve through regular or good dieting. Interestingly, if you couple the exercise during the weight loss phase, couple the dieting with the exercise, there's also not really an added effect of the exercise during the weight loss, at least. Now, then of course, weight loss is not something that we just achieve and then everything is easy afterwards. But actually, we're in a way, if people successfully lose weight, there's a lot of evidence showing that they have to really, in a way, change their lifestyle sustainably in the long term to maintain that low weight and really prevent. It's really all about preventing then subsequent weight regain. And that's the nice thing here. That's where exercise can be really helpful, whether you do it during the weight loss phase, but also then specifically kind of during the phase when our body weight starts to creep up. And again, that's something we should know. I think about it within the 5 years or so, 80% of weight are usually regained. So, I mean, the majority of the people that even if they are successfully losing weight, they will go back to their normal weight within a reasonable period of time. And again, this is where exercise can really be beneficial.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting. You put a lot on the table there. So if I can try and crudely summarize, and I'm going to get this probably wrong a bit, you can temper around the edges when I say, okay. So first of all, most people have limited time and limited fitness levels to be able to burn that many calories from exercise. I mean, I think this is quite a big issue. So somebody might have an hour every couple of days, let's say, on average, to do some exercise. I mean, obviously it will vary markedly, but that might be an average. And then most people aren't super fit, they're not Olympians. And so when they get on that treadmill or get on that exercise bike, they're not actually producing a particularly high power output, so that their rate of calorie burn isn't that high. So after an hour of exercise, every other day for a few weeks, the total calories that they burned just isn't that much relative to the number of calories they're ingesting. And they need to ingest lots of calories because people burn a lot of calories even when they're just at rest. Okay. On top of that, the body has most people's bodies tends to compensate at least partially. So those calories that are burned, people tend to become hungry. Their bodies make them hungry, and they tend, most people, to eat at least some additional calories to at least partially compensate for that. In contrast, if someone, and this is more easily said than done, if someone was able to diet to the point that, say, they halve their calories, for example, they might have half the size of breakfast, half the size of lunch, and half the size of dinner. That's a big ask, but if they were able to do that, then they would experience a really big calorie deficit, far bigger than almost certainly they're able to generate from doing exercise. And so in principle, at least, dieting is more obviously the route to losing weight. In the end, a combination of the two is perhaps most powerful. And the exercise, for whatever the reasons are, and it's partly psychological, the exercise seems to be valuable for maintaining weight loss. But even then, it's not easy to do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I want to add one thing, because, I mean, first of all, I don't want to propagate to not exercise while you lose weight. I think this is the wrong message to take home. I think it's actually really important. And in a way, this is what when we do studies too, where we have groups that exercise and a group that don't exercise, even if they're there on the same calorie deficit, that means the people that exercise, they can actually eat more. So they don't have to restrict themselves as much. So it's from a psychological perspective, actually, it's nicer because you're not cutting their food in half. Maybe you're cutting their food by 25%. So that's the number one thing I want to add. So there's and then there's all these other effects that we haven't really got to talk to about. Is, for example, changes in body composition, etc. But I wanted also to add, and this is something that, you know, within the exercise camp. So first of all, we have the nutrition versus exercise camp. Now I'm going to open a new can of worms and say, okay, well, we also have the resistance versus endurance exercise or aerobic exercise. Like of course, people are not going to lose weight from aerobic exercise. I've heard this, but because people need to, you know, bulk up and build their muscle because that burns much more calories, which is just not true. I mean, we can clearly, when we measure, so you mentioned aerobic exercise, running or cycling as something. This is really in a way, the greatest energy deficit that we can incur through exercise. If you do resistance training, the effects of resistance, or the actual caloric footprint of resistance training is quite low, because you're moving a lot of weight at once, but you only move it once or maybe 10 times or so. Whereas if you're constantly running or cycling, you have a higher energy expenditure. There's something to be said about, you know, you're building muscle, which costs the body some energy, but it's really not that. So the aerobic piece is actually something that I did want to mention specifically, because that often gets overlooked too. If you go to the gym, the most, in terms of calories, the most effective thing really you can do is running or cycling or swimming.
Okay, so something
anything that has a high energy oxygen turnover, where you're turning over a lot of energy substrate by oxidizing it, so where you're breathing heavily the whole time. Whereas with resistance exercise, there's a lot of breaks in between. I think we all know that.
And longer than people realize, I think, quite often. They're having a minute rest between sets, but it turns out to be 3 minutes. However, there's heightened energy expenditure during exercise per se, but there can also be heightened energy expenditure after the exercise, as the body, broadly speaking, recovers. Mm-hmm. And some would make the argument that, well, regardless of whether you're doing resistance exercise, so typically lifting weights, or aerobic exercise, as we've discussed, running, cycling, swimming, etc., that a substantial part of the additional energy expenditure due to exercise happens after the event, happens during hours, maybe even days to some degree, as the body recovers, whatever that means, from that exercise. And so resistance exercise perhaps comes to the fore in this when one factors in this post-exercise, increase in energy expenditure. What say you?
Well, I agree with you, except for one word. I think I would really like to delete the substantial, because there is this notion, and when you really look into the literature, is how big is this post-exercise energy expenditure? If like again, it seems to be highest, and you said that it seems to be highest with really high intensity exercise. So whether it's resistance training, high intensity interval training, and these things. But even then, in that case, you achieve about 8% of the energy that was, so that this is 8% more than the energy that you've expended during exercise. So let's say you've expended 300 kcals during an exercise bout of high intensity interval training, which is quite a lot when you do high intensity interval training, because you have the high intensity, but then you have the rest again. So that would be would be a really good workout. Then 8% of 300. Yeah, do the math. That's what, 24 calories. So yes, the effect exists. It's measurable. It is measurable over a long time, but it's really just quite marginal. So this is when when working in practice, also when we do interventions, or we actually work with people, rather exercise 10 minutes more. You're getting a lot more out of it than hoping for these few added calories. So again, this is not saying this doesn't happen, but we shouldn't just rely on that, because again, whenever we tell people this is going to be I don't know, I'm using the kind of the Facebook advertisement that you get, is like, this is going to burn this and this much, and yes, even as it exists, it's in a way an academic decision, but as a end consumer, I take it home as basically, in a way, often as an excuse to eat more. And then, so let's say you count on these extra calories, but let's say 24 calories, that's 2 gummy bears basically. Yeah. So if people say, oh well, I'm burning more and more, so I can eat I can eat more. That's always, and this is the reality that we unfortunately see, which is why people either don't lose weight or even gain weight while they exercise.
Now, people can also, you alluded earlier, Karsten, people might gain weight for another reason, potentially, particularly, well, I was going to say particularly if they're doing resistance exercise, but maybe it doesn't make too much difference for people starting out. So people jump on the scales and weigh themselves. They may find, for example, they haven't lost weight, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's been no changes to their body, and maybe positive changes depending on how you view it, because particularly for people who are starting out with this, so it could be aerobic exercise and not just resistance exercise, it's quite conceivable, that they're losing some portion of body fat and gaining some degree of muscle. It's not that the body's trying to compensate exactly so that the body's weight stays the same. It's just that, they put on some muscle because the body augments in response to the perceived exercise that it has to do, and may lose some fat because it tends to access fat stores as the first port of call when burning extra calories. So there don't tend to be enormous changes in non-Olympic athletes who train, but nonetheless, just weighing ourselves can be an unfortunate misrepresentation of sort of good things that are happening to our bodies in response to exercise. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I thought, whenever you say these things and you kind of come out as maybe a little bit provocative, I was thinking, of course, if you exercise and your weight stays stable, you're still doing a lot of good things. So this shouldn't really not be understood as not exercising. You're doing a lot of things cardiovascularly, and like you said, you're improving your metabolism overall. You're most likely, if your weight stays, and I would actually take the more so the resistance training, because this is where you actually set a stimulus for your muscle mass to grow. So you have actual muscle proteins in it. With endurance exercise, usually we don't really stimulate muscle proteins, at least not the muscle proteins that we want, that we see in terms of muscle mass gains. But with resistance exercise, you do increase that, and that growth actually costs the body a little bit of energy too. So that transformation in a way actually happens. and it is beneficial because you're also improving, you're making your fat or adipose tissue more sensitive. By growing your muscle, you're becoming more insulin sensitive, for example. So there's many things happening with exercise. And I don't want to take that away, but if you the thing is, you're right about looking at the scale is only giving you a body weight. You don't get any information about where the weight is located and what compartment is located. But again, if we're talking about weight loss, usually we talk about individuals where it's not just a lifestyle thing, but it's actually in a way a medical thing. If you're talking about individuals with overweight or obesity, that weight loss, in a way you have to achieve that weight loss to have clinically or really clinically measurable improvements in many other health outcomes. And that's really you do get what you see on the scale. Yes, maybe 1 or 2% may be explained by muscle mass, but if you really want to achieve a 5% or a 10% weight loss, you have has to come from body fat too. It can't all be just explained by that. So that's really something that, yeah, if you we do that in many studies where we actually then look at weight loss and kind of, how well does weight loss correlate with fat loss? Because that's what we really want to lose instead of losing body weight. And with most of the interventions, the correlation coefficient is somewhere around 0.9. So yeah, 10% are explained by kind of other variations in body composition, but the majority for meaningful weight loss is really explained by that.
Okay, so weight loss equals fat loss, pretty much.
If it's large enough, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's one thing, and I don't know, when I was 16 or so, I went to the US for a year and I started weightlifting a little bit. And you can't tell based on my body type anymore. But at the time, and people always told me, you know what, muscle is heavier than fat. And I think it was their way to say that, I don't know, in what way muscle metabolizes more, it is more active or anything. But I never understood that term. But it's often used in that sense. 1 kilogram of muscle weighs exactly as much as 1 kilogram of fat. So first of all, that's, I don't know, if you're comparing these things, fat is, it is an energy storage, is ultimately energy dense. So the energy that's stored in 1 kilogram of fat is much higher than the energy that's stored, and even the energy it takes to build up 1 kilogram of muscle mass. So this basically conversion also can't really just happen. And one last thing I want to mention, because you spoke a lot about the kind of the mere mortals, but I have a discussion with my colleague who is really a proponent of resistance exercise for weight loss, and he always comes, well, if you look at these bodybuilders, they have large amounts of muscle mass, and they're so like no subcutaneous fat or no fat at all, and but if you look at what they're doing, is they're dieting hardcore before these events. They're really dieting hardcore. And I know you maybe didn't want to talk about the Minnesota starvation study, but this is in a way we were seeing they're doing quite similar things to what people have done in these studies. They're really starving themselves down, and that's something they don't do just by building muscle. That's what they actively do through I'm not saying that it's healthy, but through a very restrictive.
So Karsten, let's do this. Let's do this then. So let's do this. So we're gonna talk about bodybuilders and how far that is analogous to people voluntarily being starved during a long-term study in Minnesota. So can you walk us through, fairly briefly, but can you walk us through what the Minnesota study, a very famous study within the realm of human energy dynamics and dieting. Can you walk us through the Minnesota study, and then maybe we can allude to how that's weirdly a bit like bodybuilding today?
Yeah. Well, gladly. I'll try my best, but I have to say it's a little bit. I've read a lot about this, but I've also actually listened to a podcast about this by Malcolm Gladwell, who had actually 4 episodes on this, which was quite informative. But he dove a little bit more into kind of how this story was, how this whole story emerged. If you ever happen to,
before you go, I do apologise. I'm going to try. Can you try after I ask you to put your headset on? Can I now ask you to take it off, and let's see what happens if you take it off now? Yeah. I mean, you look even more handsome, obviously. Now talk. Say something about football.
What do you want me to say? Is it better?
Say England are really good at football.
I can't say that. No, England is in the semi-final.
Yeah, that's more accurate, I think. Yeah. It does sound really different, but we're gonna try this. So we're gonna tell us all about, concisely, but in your way, the Minnesota trial, and then segue into bodybuilders who seem to be doing the exact opposite of what people did in the Minnesota trial, but in some senses they're not. Karsten, take it away.
Okay, well, so the Minnesota starvation study, really short, I'll keep it short, is there basically happened around or at the end of World War II in the United States. Volunteers, healthy male volunteers, normal weight, I should add that, were basically kept at the University of Minnesota facilities for, I think, 24 weeks is how long the actual starvation period lasted, and then they were actually kept for additional, now I think it's 12 weeks, I'm not sure, but for some time afterwards. So basically what happened is they as the name says, they cut their calories by about 55% in total. So that was the largest energy deficit. So individuals lost, I think, about 23% of their body weight. They lost about 70% of their fat mass, and they lost about 20-some% of their muscle mass. So this is quite significant change. And if you just Google and you look at these pictures of the individuals before and after, you can see that they've really starved. And now again, from a historic perspective, of course, this was World War II with the Holocaust. So I think there were also historic events that led to the study of what happens when for a prolonged period of time we do not get enough energy, because in many countries suffering from World War II, dietary energy was really limited, rationed, so to say, and extremely rationed. And so that was one part of the study. The second part of the study is that they then refed the individuals first in a controlled way. So they received the calories that they were missing in a way back. So they slowly graded up the calories. And then at the end, actually, they let the participants lose and basically let them eat as much as they want. So, and this is the really interesting phase. I mean, everything is interesting. You see the change in body weight. You see the changes in what they were able to measure in terms of metabolism. So, for example, energy expenditure. You see the changes in body composition, and there's a lot of research. Or it's a lot of things that have come out of this Minnesota starvation, like the skin fold measurements and equations for all that. So this has been, in a way, even more informative, I think, for the exercise and nutrition community than just on the energetic side. But so the weight loss was really was interesting. But what I personally find more interesting was what happens after the weight loss. And so the people quickly regained weight, the participants. And at the end of the study, actually, they slightly shot over their original weight. So after this immense starvation and then the refeeding, they came back, let's say, almost to their normal weight. But at the end, on average, they had about 60% more body fat. Because in a way they lost muscle mass, they lost fat mass, but the way the body then also adapts to then the sudden, the infinite amounts of energy that seemed to be available all of a sudden, and the energy was stored differently than it was in a way released from the body before. So this is, and also the people at the end, I said there was this phase where they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted, and they really were overeating, this hyperphagic phase. And this is kind of really interesting study that to look at what, for dieting, really what we see is people might, even if they're successful dieting, I think the harder part is really then keeping that weight off, or keeping it low rather than preventing kind of the weight to slowly creep up or even go on a binge at some point and basically just, replete those calories, because there seems to be something very strong about our physiology that tells us whenever we have food available, especially in a situation of deprivation, we'll hold on to every single calorie, and if there is energy around, we'll take it.
Yeah, so the Minnesota trial is extreme dieting is perhaps a modern phrase to describe it. And these guys, and they were men, they lost a huge amount of weight. They looked extremely gaunt, extremely thin by the end of the experiment, and they were, as you pointed out, most of that loss was fat, but they did lose other tissues as well to some fair degree. When you're starved that much, you're going to. And yes, similarly to someone who's been on a diet, maybe with exercise, they might lose weight, but there's a tendency for a lot of people to then start to put that body weight back on. For these guys, the Minnesota starvation trials, the elastic band, if you like, had been stretched so much, it snapped back very quickly in the sense that they really overate and they put weight back on very, very quickly, overshot. But on top of that, their composition, having overshot their original weight, so they were heavier than they were before, was different. There was more fat, and actually maybe on somehow stored in different parts of the body to some degree. I don't know whether that was visually observable, but an analysis demonstrated that. Where they were a bit more pear-shaped for a while.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, this is I do not know this about the Minnesota starvation study, but I know this, for example, about anorexia nervosa patients. They recover usually. They have more visceral adipose tissue, so kind of the belly fat, for example, and less. They're predominantly female, so they're more, like you said, pear-shaped. More apple-shaped. Less pear-shaped. I think that's what you were referring to. So this is, like I said, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case also in the Minnesota starvation study.
And do you know whether that is a long-term or indefinite change, or whether that can then morph back to kind of the original setup or the original body shape later on?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I know from the kind of the historical side that the participants in the Minnesota starvation study didn't really suffer in the long term. They were actually quite healthy afterwards, so there wasn't detrimental to their physical health or so to undergo that cycle. With the anorexia nervosa patients, as far as I know the literature, I'm not an expert on this, but I think I remember that this is something that seems to be a little bit more permanent. But again, there's also multiple things happening. For example, I mean, just reproductive function, for example, we all know changes body composition, changes body shape. For example, we know this with menopause, for example. There's a change in body composition in women, and so it's intertwined. It's not just the calories, but there's also the effect of calories on other body systems that then also drive changes in how we look and where energy is stored in a way.
Now, bodybuilders who are in a very different physical shape to someone who's been on the Minnesota trial starving themselves for 12 weeks or whatever. But nonetheless, there are some analogies between those two situations. So we all know that bodybuilders lift lots of weights to build up their muscles. But it's not just that's creating that bodybuilding shape. I mean, aside from maybe other things they may be adding to their bodies, but that's another story.
There's also bodybuilders,
focusing on natural bodybuilders, or there's something else going on. You're alluding to the fact, well, they've got this terribly tricky situation where they want as bigger muscles as possible, as far as I can tell, and basically as little fat as possible. And that's not easy to do, because on the one hand, you doing all these exercises, resistance exercises, predominantly to encourage muscle growth, while at the same time you're trying to not eat too much so that you can encourage fat loss. How does that play out?
Well, I mean, I would actually challenge that they're not the primary goal. I don't think is really to have as much muscle as possible, but it's actually to have as much muscle visible as possible. I think that's so. There's if you were truly saying, okay, I want as much muscle mass as possible, and you don't care about your body fat percentage, what it looks like, whether you're really lean or, then you could look into I don't know, sumo athletes or into American football, for example. Like there you see people who have large amounts of muscle mass and possibly also larger amounts of body fat, but the bodybuilders in a way, they are in this conundrum. So it's really something that, when they do undergo some meaningful body transformation. So we have some data from some own subjects, but also currently working on a review of the literature. And they're losing up to 10% weight in kind of in preparation for an event, and that's basically all fat. They're not losing any muscle mass. They're not in that phase. They're not gaining any muscle mass either. So you gain. If you gain the muscle first and then you try to preserve it as much, that's why they're training so hard. They're not gaining more, but they're trying to at least maintain that. So that's the one part of that is, and that's really through very restrictive dieting. There are other strategies with fluid losses, etc. I don't want to go all into that. So there's more affecting body weight than just or what you look like than just energy too. But why I find them so intriguing is also after their events they go back to their weight quite quickly, and in many cases they eat quite let's say unrestricted. There's a lot of overcompensation also happening. They're eating. I mean, again, this is part of their sport. There's a lot of food restriction before and then afterwards. Binging going on. So they're quickly going back to their normal weight. And again, we also know that some of them actually overshoot. That is, in a way, the most economical way to store energy is the body fat. That's why our body is, in a way, always set up to, excess energy being stored in body fat. I don't know if body fat is very low, I think there is probably some signal going on that we want, in a way, higher body fat percent. But I don't think if you have someone with a body fat percent of 5 or 6%, I don't think there's inherently something screaming, okay, I want to be at 12 or 15%, or 20% or 30%. Because again, the 5 or 6 or 7% body fat are usually enough to allow me to survive for a relatively long period of time. So the extra fat that I have doesn't really provide that much more of a cost. I think really the extra fat that we carry around, or most of us carry around, really more driven by lifestyle factors than kind of the physiology.
Maybe, but maybe we're missing a trick in thinking that body fat is all about energy. Maybe there are other things that the fat is giving the body. I mean, I'm not quite joking when I say cushioning.
Oh yeah, no, totally. Insulation. Insulation. I mean, we have some interesting data. I'm not going to say too much about it, but it actually looks like we have some. There definitely you could argue that in a way it keeps us warmer. And that's but yeah, so that I think we have to differentiate a little bit, and I think the current literature in the field of obesity really does it well, where we say, okay, we have the different types of body fat or adipose tissue that have different functions, but there's what we really see with overweight and obesity specifically is we're not gaining any healthy fat, we're gaining unhealthy fat. And actually the body in a way is trying to get this fat then also causes systemic inflammation, etc. So this is the unhealthy side. But in a way, you're right. On normal to low levels, there is a very important, or there are very important functions that go way beyond. I mean, there's evidence that, for example, certain certain hormones are stored, or certain vitamins, for example, are stored. There's some conversion of hormones in adipose tissue going on, and so forth. So that is definitely true.
Is there an effect of time of day on exercising?
On what? That would be my question back, because I think we currently look a lot in the effect of time of day on weight and food intake. I think this is what we've been talking about so much, but of course there are effects of time of day on exercise, on metabolic parameters. So usually we have higher levels of fat oxidation at, for example, in the morning, we see that. But if you really focus, I assume you want to focus a little bit more on food intake and body weight regulation and so forth. Is that correct?
Let's go down that path.
Yeah, good. So we are, I mean, the thing is that we don't know whether it's really the time of day or whether it's kind of a side product of what we do throughout the day. So let's give a simple example. If I exercise in the morning, and most literature, scientific literature, if people exercise in the morning, they often do it in a fasted state. Means they haven't eaten for 10 to 12 hours. And we do that in the scientific world, we do that often because we want to have things very controlled. And this is kind of the ultimate control. We know that what your blood looks like. For example, when you go to the doctor, you're often told not to eat anything for the last 10 to 12 hours. So this is, so if you want to compare exercise in the morning with exercise in the evening, you would have to create really the same conditions. But we don't go throughout a day and not eating. Or very rarely, and then also we sleep before we exercise in the morning. We don't sleep, or most of us don't sleep before they exercise in the evening. So, and this is, I have a colleague who's a chronobiologist, and basically there's something we don't fully know whether it's the timing of the day or just everything that happens around. From a practical perspective, it doesn't matter, because I'm not going to get up in the middle of the night to eat a meal. Then go exercise if I want to go for a run at 6 o'clock in the morning. That's not going to happen. So we will always have these conditions. But it comes back to this question that some studies actually see a better effect, or people are losing more weight in the morning when they exercise in the morning compared to when they exercise in the evening. Some studies only see that in women, but not in men. Other studies see no effect. And I think a lot of that has to do with kind of all these things happening around. But we're currently working on some of this. So what we see is when people exercise in the morning in a fasted state, and the same is actually true whether they exercise in the morning or evening. So we've tried to replicate that as well as possible, to have people fast for 12 hours in the evening. But when they exercise in the morning, or in a fasted state, we tend to eat more afterwards than if we had a breakfast before exercise. But interestingly, we don't make up for all of the calories that we eat. So if we have a second breakfast after exercise, and we have a second, whether I've exercised fasted or not fasted, you would eat maybe more during the second breakfast if you've exercised in a fasted state. But you won't get all the calories in that you would eat with your first, or the people have eaten with their first breakfast. So, and we see that not only for a single meal, but actually for the subsequent meals too. So there seems to be some compensation again happening. Whether that's really a trick to get you into losing more weight with exercise, we'll actually see. So we have a proposal under review right now. So maybe in 2 or 3 years, I can tell you more about that. But yeah, it is. I think it's a question we hear quite often, because that is one side. Now, coming back to everything I said earlier, we also have to consider that having something to eat before exercise may also affect, for example, how long you exercise, how high your exercise intensity is, and that will also affect how many calories you burn. So in a way, sometimes having something before exercise may actually help you burn more calories. So it's always the two sides of that. And so this is why it makes it, on the one side, extremely fascinating, but on the other side, also extremely difficult to study.
Indeed. I wonder, I'd speculate whether this comes back to this issue of the body will almost inevitably compensate to some degree for additional activity. When we say the body, we mean, we feel hungry, and for most of us, it breaks us in the end, and we do eat some more, whether it's straight after exercise or later in the day, or just need that extra biscuit in the evening, or maybe even the next day we need a bigger breakfast. At some point, we tend to feel hungry and will compensate to some degree. However, often not entirely. So if we're able to burn enough calories during an exercise session, we are likely to eat more later on in the day, but not enough to fully compensate.
Right.
And maybe similarly, there is a trick, in inverted commas, a trick to getting up in the morning, not having breakfast, doing some exercise, probably not feeling hungry during the exercise, because for some reason bodies don't typically. I mean, you can, but you don't tend to. And by the time breakfast has been missed, so there's a missed opportunity to take in calories, some exercise has been done, so some additional calories have been burned. When the body then makes us more hungry in an attempt to compensate for that, there's quite a big gap, energy deficit being created by the lack of breakfast and the exercise being done on top. That although there is some additional eating, the compensatory mechanism may be a long way from full. And so in theory, I've no doubt this is not a magic bullet for losing weight, but although, if it is, then
we're going to sell a book, and
we're going to, we'll sell a book, and all the beers are on you for the next few years. But yeah, whether it makes a difference in the long run, I don't know. I'm not suggesting that it's the way to do it, but it may be pulling together these ideas of eating less while doing some exercise for part of the day enables us to outrun the partial compensation, so that despite this compensation, we do still blooming well lose some noteworthy number of calories sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was just thinking as you were explaining this, basically, you just explained in a way why time-restricted feeding works. Or it doesn't work magically because there's something about this, it works because people are eating less calories because they have less time to eat. So in a way, you can always, I mean, first of all, the more you exercise, the more calories you're kind of running behind the calories. So on the upper extreme side, actually, we do see that we have challenges getting all the calories in because but yeah, you have less time to eat, and you also have more periods in which you don't feel hungry. So you said that, especially right after exercise, we see no difference in levels of hunger, whether the people have eaten before the exercise or not. So right after exercise, you ask them, how hungry are you? They're not hungry, even if they've fasted for 12 or 14 hours, which is quite interesting. Now it comes back later, but initially, kind of right at the end of exercise, or even during the exercise, if we're asking them at the time, you see that. There's something about the exercise that acutely makes you less hungry. And so you're creating less of a window of opportunity. And I think this is what it's a lot about in our society, the way that we have plenty of full of food, and we don't really have to move much. So you're creating more opportunities to be in a deficit, or less opportunities to overeat in a way. And I think that's one of the tricks why exercise actually, I include that often in my talks. It's also really helpful to prevent not only the weight regain, but also really helpful in preventing the weight gain in the first place. People who are more active tend to gain less weight than people who are sedentary over kind of their lifetime.
So that brings me to the final point. It's kind of the natural question in a way, which is, so Professor Koehler, what would you recommend people do who are looking to apply exercise combined with dieting for weight loss? What are the best fundamental things they can employ to maximize the chances of making this work and stick for them?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, just speaking practically, find something that works for you. If you don't enjoy exercising, or if you don't enjoy running, then you shouldn't be running. Then you try biking, swimming, and so forth. You have to It's only something you can sustain over the long term. That's the first thing. We can do many things. We can do many diets and many exercise things for a short period of time. So first of all, it has to be sustainable. So then on top of that, my personal recommendation is always do exercise as much as you can, as much as you feel like it, as much as your physical fitness and other health issues allow. But the more you can exercise, the easier it is to do all these other things. But if you really want to lose weight, you will have to restrict yourself. You cannot let yourself go haywire after exercise. If you really want to achieve a clinically meaningful weight loss goal of 5 or 10%, it won't be enough to not eat more when you exercise. You actually have to, you will have to cut calories at some point too, and also find ways that allow you to cut calories in the long term. Because again, there will at some point come the phase when you stop dieting and you achieve also, or you have to arrive at your new, in a way, your new lifestyle. So this is again why I think the sustainability, not from an environmental perspective, but what you can do is really, really, really important. So only things that you can do every day, or at least in terms of exercise, every other day or so, you should do. Again, ideally, if you in terms of exercise, do aerobic exercise because it does burn a lot of calories. Build in some resistance exercise because it helps you preserve the muscle mass or even build some muscle mass, which is advantageous. But yeah, I think really remember that if you, at least for the acute or the actual weight loss phase, we'll have to do some dieting.
So yes, it can't just be down to the exercise. It's got to be some real genuine calorie restrictions, which means feeling hungry sometimes.
If you're okay with losing 1 to 2 kilograms, then exercise will be enough. That's usually not the weight goal that people come to us with. They want to lose more weight, and so that's really where you do have to diet. But it's a lot easier with exercise.
Professor Koehler, thank you so much. I think that's covered all we wanted to chat about today with a brilliant finish and lots of useful advice for people. It's not easy, but there are some strategies out there that can help. Super interesting, that interface between the blue skies physiology, the pure physiology of what's going on in the body, but then of course inevitably, naturally, how can we use that? How can we apply our understanding to get a better handle on sort of weight control in a world which is still spiraling out of control obesity wise? Anyway, every bit of advice there is very, very helpful. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.